school level. My background is in herpetology, so not yet climate science, but this is an issue that affects everyone.
Good morning. Oh, that works well. I'm Claire Datnow, a retired school teacher. I'm
done a lot of work now in outreach related to climate change, so I'm honored to be part of this panel today.
I'm Gabriella Ehinger. I teach at Huntington College. I teach mostly environmental science, environmental studies, environmental justice class, and then whatever the department needs at any given semester. So.
Climate change is here, already changing Alabama. Average temperatures up 3 degrees since 1960. Heat waves and flooding on the rise. Hurricanes are bigger, slower, and more intense. Many of our ecosystems are struggling under this pressure. Alabama must prepare for climate change that is unavoidable and do our part to mitigate how bad climate crisis gets. It can get a lot worse if we maintain the status quo. Scientists are warning us that we must keep total warming to below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. We're already at 2.4 Fahrenheit. Beyond that, we're looking at a planetary climate that, put simply, will be hostile to humanity. Loss of agricultural lands, water shortages, deadly heat waves, wildfires and storms, and the loss of low-lying islands and coastal cities. We still have the capacity to avoid the worst that climate change can offer. And a bonus, the solutions that work best to minimize climate change will improve our lives. After the transition, we will have a cleaner and more reliable energy source. This will be less toxic pollution in our air and water. And getting there will be stimulating vast economic growth as new technologies are adapted. To make this transition, which I call the big fix, we need systematic change. In particular, this means changing our energy, food, and transportation systems. But vested interests are resistant to this change, and they're getting away with it because there are not enough people aware of what's at stake. There's a role as educators is critically important. We must provide our students with the information and context for appreciating this moment in human history so that we are empowered to be part of the solution.
So I would just add to Scott's comments that Alabama is facing a cost. I mean, there's going to be a cost to adaptation. There's going to be cost to the infrastructure. So sometimes people identify with cost. You've looked at the tremendous bill our country has accrued in severe weather events, the fires out west, and all these hugely strong weather and crisis events we're facing. Billions of dollars of federal money and state money is used to address the costs of climate change. So I think that's important. And then I would re-emphasize what Scott said, that, there's a wonderful benefit to doing the right thing in our own human health. I'm very proud that UAB, my university, has now decided to establish a Center for Climate Change and Human Health. And our Dean of the School of Public Health, Paul Irwin, has been given 7 faculty lines to hire 7 professionals from around the world to establish the first climate center and human health in our state. There's a direct relationship between burning fossil fuel and the number of lives that are lost to lung disease. And often it's the lowest income people in our state that are positioned near these places that are burning fossil fuel and are paying a direct price for that. So that's my addition.
Learning about climate change involves reading, writing, finding valid sources, interpreting, and creating graphs. This falls under the category of literacy as well, and performing calculations. Students can create stories of how carbon travels through the atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. Have student research make a presentation on where the different forms of fossil fuel are found in Alabama, and the geological history of why they are found where they are.
Storytelling or fiction can be another powerful way for students to understand how climate change has and will impact their future. Cli-Fi can serve as a springboard for lively discussions. In addition, stories offer ways in which students can envision and adjust to climate change through new technology and social adaptations. The ideas discussed from the story can be used to encourage more class reading, enrich a unit on this topic, and hopefully inspire students to do more research or create their own stories, poems, or drawings about the future altered by climate change. Climate change should be integrated at all levels. It should be included in the sciences and also in the arts, languages, civics, and history. Part of the challenge of climate change is that the apocalyptic consequences of our carbon use are emerging globally rather than in a single newsworthy disaster, making it difficult to envision and react. Fiction exploring the possibilities of a changed and changing climate can be a powerful way to make these abstract futures more immediate for ourselves and our students and help them to feel empowered to take action.
We try to bring real-world, real-time stories and experiences. I live in Cahaba Heights in Birmingham, and we've seen increasing flooding in the last several years. And the other day, one of the streets that is prone to flooding literally filled the homes. And I went by a couple days later, and all of the hardwood floors were ripped out and were stacked along the edge of the street. It looked a little bit like a scene from New Orleans after the hurricane. And I thought, if I was teaching grade school in Cahaba Heights, I'm talking about this. I mean, you walk by this street your entire life, and here's a wonderful opportunity to bring up something that's local and that's happening. I would reiterate Claire's emphasis on storytelling. I build that into my lectures, and it's just amazing how powerful storytelling is. The students will respond to it. Even the parents, if you get parents that are concerned about, you're talking about climate change, building stories into that discussion is important too. Anything you want to add? Okay.
Frame it as a serious issue, but it also presents many opportunities for new inventions and technologies to help solve the crisis. They can be part of this. I agree with all that's said above on this. Doomism is our greatest threat right now. Too many people have given up or decided there's nothing that can be done. And these are the people who believe climate change and understand it as a problem. To counteract, I keep running a list of facts and trends to cite to show how we are making meaningful and large-scale progress. Among the positives that we have are all the science and technology we need to make significant progress. We still have time to avoid the worst of climate crisis. I would also like to emphasize that the future we need to overcome this crisis creates a much better world. It will be more cleaner, more secure, and both nature and humanity can thrive again.
4 or 5, maybe even 6 sections of environmental science a year. And it feels like a lot of bad news, and I have to compartmentalize that a little bit. Like, we all do that to a certain extent, right? To get through the sort of landscape of human misery, right? You just gotta go about your day. And we've kind of been talking about some of these things we do already, as I really work in past fixes. Like, here's a problem that we solved, and Dr. McClintock used the ozone layer as an example of a problem we fix. I like to do like leaded gaslit. And I talk to the students about how, I date myself by recalling about how when I was a kid we could get leaded around with it. And that's always fun. And then I talked to them about how we fixed it. We phased it out. We knocked the automobile industry out of business. There were people who didn't want it. We continued to do it. And just last year, I believe the last barrel of leaded gasoline was, combusted somewhere in the world. It's done. And so, our air quality is better, atmospheric lead has dropped way off. And by the way, the same guy that invented leaded gasoline invented chlorofluorocarbons that are the ones over there. He's like a one-man walking disaster. So, a couple of things that I've been struggling with is I've been using the same textbook for about 5 years. That textbook is the newer, was that edition of the one we've been using for 10 years, which means my climate data is, and the attitude about teaching climate data is pretty dated. So I've started this search to kind of start looking for a new textbook, which I thought would be easy. And I feel like I'm looking for a unicorn, right? Because lately what I do is I pull up the climate change chapter and I review that first. What do they say? And what I'm finding is there's a lot of textbooks out there. They're fine. They're fine, but they're all sort of the same. They're boldface words and they're structured the same. And the one book I really liked, I got to the climate change chapter, it was not as good as, there's a lot of individual action that you can take, but not enough sort of, policy work and things. But I'm sure, I'm probably going to go with it, but add my own stuff to it. And that led me to look into, I found a webinar by a group called Climate Outreach that constantly had a webinar on climate visuals and what kind of imagery we should be transitioning to tell a story. And they had this, I put it in our resource list. And it was also related to the Yale program on climate change communication. And so there are whole groups working on how do we communicate this. Like people have looked at what kinds of images are the most, effective. And there were some interesting things that I hadn't thought about. Like, we got to tell new stories. The polar bear is fine, right? That's an okay story. The polar bear on ice is stopped. It's okay, but everybody's heard that. And it's tiresome, and it feels very singular in nature. It's the polar bears. Well, it's everything. And so it talks about telling real stories and show real people. Don't use stock photography. Right? Get away from the generic pictures of solar arrays. One thing it said, it talked about emotionally powerful images. And put in as much solution-based imagery as you can. And then there was one that I thought was interesting. It was a caution about using protest imagery. Knowing your audience, because protest imagery can be a real turn-off if you're dealing with, to all of us that would be ugly, that's great. But if you're going out to a population that you're not sure about, where they stand, you might not want to put pictures of protests in, because that could be too distant from their reality. I'm sorry. I'm used to standing up.
Right? I got it. So here's our next question. How best meet students where they are with regard to their knowledge, attitudes, and questions about climate change? And Claire had some ideas on this.
All of the above are needed. Causes, impacts, and solutions, but in a balanced proportions. The scary information is necessary to get people's attention, but it must be balanced with reasons to be hopeful and messages of empowerment. Provide concrete evidence for a hopeful outlook, what is called evidence-based hope. Teachers need to educate themselves first to be sure they have a good background and depth of content knowledge to answer the simple questions and to know where to look for answers with their students for the harder ones. Start with students giving an understanding of carbon and how it moves and how it is causing changes in temperatures. Other climate-forcing gases can also be discussed in higher grades. We must make sure there's a concept of sources and sinks. Educators provide demos. Example, CO2 in a bottle and plain air in another, then put in front of them light with a thermometer in each. Have them interact and explore with actual graphs and data. Plenty of sources to get data. Must be careful to find ones that are in a format that is accessible and understandable to their age group. Use technology, for example, NASA Earth Observation, NEO, plus Earth Google, ProbeWare, etc. Have class discussions. What would you like to know about climate change? What data do you think scientists would need to answer the question, etc.? Keep focused on the data and how to answer the questions rather than engaging in political type debates. Make it as locally relevant as possible. Many scales possible: global, country, region, state, local. Encourage them to think of solutions all throughout the lesson.
I believe we should not sugarcoat the climate crisis. Instead, we should provide data-based solutions that will lead to wise actions.
So I had a student, freshman, come to me once after class and say, Dr. McClintock, my parents got in a huge battle last night over global warming. It was not pretty. And I said, well, tell me where they got their information. So she went home and talked to her parents, and she found out that mom had gone online and checked out the science, legitimate science websites, and Dad had been listening to Rush Limbaugh. And the point here is that you know better than I do probably when critical thinking skills are possible to engender in K-12 students. But the better we do a job of teaching critical thinking skills, which includes learning how to vet the social websites, the internet, the better. Because there's a lot of very misleading information that's out there on climate change. And it's not just crazy people putting it out. These are paid companies that do this. And, there's an obvious benefit to delaying action in terms of some of the corporate interests, and we all know that. But they're coming around. Corporations are coming around. I take great solace in the fact that, Mercedes in our state's putting out 10 different types of electric vehicles. They're building one of the largest solar fields in the state to completely make their plant carbon neutral. This morning there was a big article in the New York Times that they opened tracks off the North Atlantic for wind generation of turbines. They'd sold billions of dollars of tracks. They were absolutely stunned that they're going to be producing enough power for 2 million homes off of the North Atlantic from offshore wind that you can't even see from the shore. They now have these wind turbines that are essentially floating. Can you imagine off the Gulf of Mexico, over the horizon, you can't see them? You could run this whole seaboard here off of solar energy. It's amazing. There's such good stories out there if you just share them. And finally, just let me add very quickly that scientists have certainly been very honest about the significant negative impacts of climate change. But I think scientists have been, and they're admitting this now, that the rate of change, if we address the problem, is much quicker than has been thought before. You've seen this if you followed what happened with COVID. You may remember there was a wonderful article that showed cities from around the world with a picture of the city pre-COVID and a year later after COVID when people had stopped driving. And you could see mountain ranges behind cities that had never existed before in anybody's sight or mind. So the changes that can happen are very healing and very rapid relative to where we thought they'd be. So I think that's something that's very hopeful.
And I have a quick just add on to this, like how much should we include? How many people in here teach in some form of K-12 school? Right, so we all have to follow our core standards, right? And you have to assess those standards. And it's important to keep, if you want to integrate, climate change across the curricula, and you want to emphasize different things, you need to keep an eye on those core curricula, and some of those are decided at the state level. And in my institution, we have set up, we have our core curriculum. You get tired of hearing about it. I'm cringing hearing myself talking about core standards, right? That's one of those emails you get. Go away. But it's important to keep an eye on those. And if you are an institution at a place where you are in a position to serve on a committee to see that that's integrated into your core standards, then it's a lot easier to get it into the classroom. It leaves less room for people who might not want to teach it or, feel comfortable or feel like they're the only ones teaching it. So you can point to the standards. So I just want to.
Sources should be examined for whether they are current and relevant, whether the source is an authority on the topic, and whether the information is accurate, whether the purpose of the writer or speaker, what is their agenda. Beware of disinformation. Disinformation is purposely deceitful to promote an agenda. There's a lot of this out there these days on topics from climate change to COVID. We are to teach our students to be on their guard and think for themselves.
First and foremost, teachers need to educate themselves about climate change. Make sure they have a good background, depth of content knowledge to answer all the simple questions. And more importantly, know where to go and find good, valid, truthful information for those ones that you might not know the answer to, so you can go with your students and find those answers. I think it's very important to model when you don't know the answer to something. Show them how you go about finding that answer. Where you go to look. It's not all just Google. Yes, you Google it, but then how you decide whether the resource you're looking at is legitimate or not. I think one good place to start, no matter what age, is starting with carbon. Again, CO2 is pretty much the biggest driver of that. And just starting with that, what is carbon? How does it move? Involved in that is a good understanding of sources and sinks. That concept is critically important, I think. And then again, how is it causing climate change? And for more advanced classes, yeah, there's lots of other gases out there, methane and things like that you can expand upon. But just having the basis of just what's carbon doing, how is it causing all this mischief, so to say, it is a great place to start.
I don't know if it's in the information sheet, but with the climate cruise I lead every year, there's a philanthropic piece, and all the guests are given a little bit of money. I take that money, we buy a piece of climate-related research equipment, we gift it to the station where I work when we visit for a day. Penguin Cam, remember that. There is a live penguin cam on the island looking at the Adelie penguins. They're there for 4 months every year. The backdrop, of course, unfortunately, is what I call a ghost rookery. There's lots of empty spots where Adelies used to be, but where the camera is on live Adelies that are raising chicks. They're cute, they're wonderful to follow. You can do behavioral work with them among your students, but the backdrop is climate. And so that's a nice way of something uplifting penguins, and then if you get to the point where you can start talking about what climate's doing to penguins, that's helpful too. So if you just go to the Palmer Station website, and put in Penguin Cam, it'll come up. 4 months out of the year. If it's not, the penguins aren't there, it's because they're not there. All right, thanks.
That's so cool. I can't make everybody looks. That's good. Thank you.
We have an opportunity not only to talk about real stories here in our state, and in our neighborhoods, but also to talk globally. I think that is a very important thing. We are global citizens. The climate crisis is happening across the globe. So in my stories, I was just led to talk about characters that live across the globe, in Sumatra, in Northern California, in Alabama. All these characters in Western Australia are being hit by wildfires, for example. So I want to expand the climate change story to stories not only on our doorstep, but to multicultural and global stories. I think that's really important that we are citizens of this planet. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm representing the 99.37% of the scientists that believe in global climate change and what's happening. And the guy sitting next to me is a scientist, has bona fide science credentials, but has decided for whatever reason that climate change is either a hoax or the data is not there. But in the eyes of the television camera or the audience, we're sitting at the same height. And this is a problem in the media, and I will give them credit. They've gotten away from this to some degree. They'll vet ahead of time. And if somebody is a well-established climate naysayer, they may not invite them to be part of the discussion anymore. They used to. And in some cases, they still do. So that's something you need to be aware of too. Just because there's two people sitting in front of a camera, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're on equal footing when it comes to the science of climate change. So be aware of that, and your students should be aware of that too.
Council for State Science Supervisors, which is a network of state science specialists just like me, all over the United States and other places. And this organization has put together some STEM teaching tools that can be used for teaching science, and specifically there have been some that can be used for teaching climate science learning. So a lot of what this panel has discussed today about the needs that we have and for how to teach and how to present climate science learning in our state, we have a tool for each one of those that you can use in your classroom. So I want to share those with you along with some other specific teaching tools.
Remember, it's real. It is us. Experts agree it is bad. There is hope.